The heat is a physical weight, pressing down on the jagged limestone of a Japanese-held atoll. A lookout, ribs visible beneath a tattered uniform, adjusts his binoculars. For months, his garrison has survived on rainwater and dwindling rations of moldy rice. He expects to see the gray silhouettes of American destroyers or the terrifying profile of an Iowa-class battleship. He expects the end to come in a flash of high explosives. But what he sees through the haze is far more demoralizing. A massive, bulbous vessel, unlike any warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy, slowly enters the lagoon. It isn't bristling with 16-inch guns. Instead, smoke rises from a galley that is churning out thousands of gallons of fresh ice cream. Behind it, a floating dry dock, a miracle of steel, swallows a damaged destroyer whole, lifting it out of the water to be repaired as if it were in a shipyard in California. To the Japanese soldier, this isn't just a military force, it is a hallucination of impossible luxury. In this moment, the tactical reality vanishes, replaced by a crushing psychological horror. He realizes he isn't just fighting a soldier, he is fighting an entire civilization that has mastered the impossible. By the dawn of the 1940s, the Pacific Ocean was not merely a theater of war, it was a logistical nightmare of incomprehensible proportions. Stretching over 60 million square miles, it was a void that swallowed empires. For the United States, the challenge was framed by a single, terrifying reality. The distance from the industrial hubs of the West Coast to the front lines in the Philippines or the Marshall Islands was greater than the distance from London to Baghdad. In the decades leading up to the conflict, the U.S. Navy's Plan Orange had envisioned a climactic, decisive battle between great fleets. However, the plan suffered from a fatal flaw. A fleet is a living organism, it breathes oil, eats ammunition, and bleeds steel. In the traditional naval doctrine of the time, a fleet was tethered to its home ports. To repair a damaged hull or refit a complex radar system, a ship had to retreat thousands of miles back to Pearl Harbor or, worse, the dry docks of Bremerton and San Francisco. This meant that for every month a ship spent in combat, it might spend 2 months in transit and repair. The Japanese Empire understood this tyranny of distance perfectly. Their strategy was built on the assumption that the American Navy would be forced to operate at the very end of a fragile, overstretched thread. They believed that by fortifying unsinkable aircraft carriers, the hundreds of islands across the Central Pacific, they could bleed the Americans dry. Each island was a fortress, and each mile the Americans advanced took them further from their source of life, making them increasingly vulnerable to a decisive counterstrike. However, the American leadership, specifically Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Raymond Spruance, began to realize that winning the war wouldn't just require better pilots or bigger guns, it required a fundamental breaking of the laws of geography. They needed a way to bring the shipyard, the warehouse, and the hospital directly into the teeth of the enemy. They didn't just need a bigger navy, they needed a navy that could build its own cities on the waves. The solution emerged in 1943 with the formal activation of Service Squadron 10, or Servron 10. It was perhaps the most radical organizational experiment in naval history. While the fast carrier task forces grabbed the headlines with their daring raids and aerial dogfights, Servron 10 was the invisible backbone that made their existence possible. The concept was simple yet staggering in its ambition. A mobile, floating base that could be moved from atoll to atoll as the front line shifted. Led by Commodore Carter, Servron 10 was designed to provide everything a modern city required. It was a conglomerate of specialized vessels, tenders, repair ships, floating dry docks, fuel tankers, and supply barges. This was the birth of the logistics revolution. Before Servron 10, if a cruiser took a torpedo to the bow, it was out of the war for 6 months. With the arrival of this floating factory, that same cruiser could be nudged into a massive floating dry dock in a remote lagoon, its hull patched by expert divers and welders, and be back in the line of fire within weeks. The logistical scale was unprecedented. American planners began to view the Pacific not as a barrier, but as a highway. They utilized concrete ships, massive barges made of reinforced concrete that served as floating warehouses for refrigerated food, dry goods, and millions of gallons of fuel. By early 1944, as the U.S. began its island-hopping campaign, Cerveron 10 was always lurking just over the horizon, ready to turn a captured, barren lagoon into the busiest port in the world overnight. The Japanese commanders, watching from their bunkers, began to see a terrifying pattern. No matter how many hits they scored, the American fleet never seemed to get smaller. It only grew. The foundation was set. The Americans had moved the factory to the front. To understand the floating factory, one must look at its most impossible achievement, the Auxiliary Floating Drydock, ABSD. Before the war, a drydock was a massive, stationary hole in the ground lined with concrete. It was the only way to repair the underside of a 45,000-ton battleship. But the U.S. Navy didn't have time to sail to Pearl Harbor, so they built drydocks that could sail themselves. These were not single ships, but massive, sectional steel structures that were towed across the ocean. Once they arrived at a forward atoll like Ulithi, the sections were welded together. To operate, the drydock would flood its ballast tanks and sink beneath the surface. The damaged warship, be it a destroyer with a shattered hull or a carrier with a twisted propeller, would sail into the submerged cradle. Then, with the roar of massive pumps, the drydock would blow its tanks, rising out of the ocean and lifting the entire ship into the air. This was the logistics angle, transformed into a technological nightmare for the enemy. Japanese reconnaissance pilots would report a sunk American carrier, only for that same carrier to reappear in a task force 3 weeks later, fully repaired and bristling with new anti-aircraft guns. The sheer industrial resourcefulness meant that the Americans were essentially cheating the natural decay of war. While Japanese ships were forced to limp home through submarine-infested waters to reach the yards at Kure or Sasebo, American ships were being overhauled in the middle of the ocean. Beside the drydocks were the repair ships, AR. These were essentially floating machine shops staffed by thousands of skilled civilian and naval technicians. They carried lathes, milling machines, and foundries capable of casting new parts from scratch. If a ship needed a part that existed only in a factory in Ohio, these men would simply build it on the spot. This level of technical autonomy meant the U.S. fleet was functionally immortal as long as the supply lines remained open. Beyond the steel and grease lay the human angle, which proved to be an even more potent psychological weapon. This was the lifestyle shock. The U.S. Navy realized that a sailor who had been at sea for 90 days didn't just need ammunition, he needed a reminder of why he was fighting. Enter the ice cream barge. To the Japanese soldier, who was often being told to eat grass to survive, the idea that the Americans had dedicated a multi-million-dollar vessel to the production of 500 gallons of ice cream every shift was incomprehensible. It was a display of wealth so obscene it bordered on the supernatural. When Japanese POWs were brought aboard American ships and saw GIs eating fresh bread, drinking chilled Coca-Cola, and receiving mail that had been written in New York only 10 days prior, the propaganda of decadent, weak Americans shattered. This was the kindness shock. In many cases, American logistics were so efficient that they began to provide for the enemy. On captured islands, civilians and surrendered soldiers were often met with rations, chocolate, and medical care that exceeded what their own government had provided in years. The floating factory wasn't just producing bullets, it was producing a vision of a world where scarcity didn't exist. This was the culture angle, the American ability to export the American dream into a war zone. The Japanese command, reading reports of these floating cities, began to experience a moral angle of defeat. They realized they weren't just being outfought, they were being out-civilized. Their samurai spirit was being crushed by a society that could afford to give its soldiers a Thanksgiving dinner with all the trimmings in the middle of a tropical lagoon. The horror for the Japanese leadership wasn't just the American bombs, it was the American bacon. By September 1944, the American island-hopping campaign reached a crescendo, but the target wasn't a mountain or a heavily fortified airfield. It was a necklace of coral and sand known as Ulithi Atoll. Located in the Caroline Islands, Ulithi possessed a lagoon so vast, nearly 200 square miles, that it could hold the entire United States Navy. When the U.S. 81st Infantry Division landed, they found only a few hundred inhabitants and no Japanese garrison. Within days, the floating factory of Servaron 10 moved in, and the world's most powerful secret was born. Ulithi became a ghost city of steel. To a Japanese scout plane, it would have looked like a nightmare manifested. At its peak, over 700 ships were anchored in the lagoon. There were no piers, no warehouses on land, and no permanent buildings. Everything was on the water. There were floating post offices handling millions of letters, floating hospitals with hundreds of beds, and even a floating recreation center on Mogmog Island where thousands of sailors were rotated for beer and baseball. The scale was so immense that it functioned with the clockwork precision of a Detroit assembly line. A carrier task force would arrive from a strike on the Philippines, depleted of fuel and battered by kamikazes. In any other war, this fleet would be out of action for months. At Ulithi, it was a pit stop. Tankers pulled alongside to pump millions of barrels of oil, ammunition ships transferred thousands of tons of high explosives via cranes, and the floating drydocks worked 24 hours a day under floodlights. This was the moment the tyranny of distance was finally executed. The Americans had effectively moved the port of San Francisco 6,000 miles west, placing it right on Japan's doorstep. Japanese command in Tokyo was initially baffled. Their intelligence suggested the U.S. fleet should be retreating to Pearl Harbor for replenishment. Instead, the Americans seemed to be everywhere at once, hitting Leyte, then Formosa, then Okinawa, with no cooling-off period. When Japanese reconnaissance finally glimpsed the scale of Ulithi, the realization was horrifying. They weren't just fighting a military, they were fighting a mobile, industrial continent that refused to leave. The turning point was not a single explosion, but a realization of permanence versus transience. During the strikes on Truk Lagoon, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, the U.S. Navy decimated the Japanese logistical hub. Japan could not replace those ships, those cranes, or those specialists. Their losses were permanent. In contrast, the U.S. answer to damage was the factory. During the battle for the Philippines, the carrier USS Franklin was hit by two 500-pound bombs, causing catastrophic fires and nearly 800 deaths. By the logic of Japanese naval warfare, the ship was a total loss. However, because of the forward repair capability, the ship was stabilized, patched enough to move, and eventually returned to service. The Japanese began to see the American fleet as a hydra, cut off one head, and the logistical tail of Servaron 10 would grow two more in its place. The psychological climax occurred when Japanese Admiral Somu Toyota realized that the decisive battle his nation had prepared for was an illusion. The U.S. was no longer playing by the rules of attrition. By late 1944, the floating factory was delivering 25% more supplies to the front lines than the Japanese could move within their own home islands. The climax was the moment the Japanese High Command acknowledged that American industrial power had reached a critical Massachusetts. The war was no longer about strategy or bravery. It was about the fact that the U.S. could build ships faster than Japan could sink them, and repair them faster than Japan could damage them. The unstoppable nature of the American machine had moved from the factory floor to the firing line. When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the sheer statistical weight of Service Squadron 10 revealed a reality that was even more staggering than the battles themselves. The floating factory had transformed the American war effort from a series of raids into a permanent, grinding occupation of the sea. By the end of 1944, the inventory managed by these mobile bases was larger than the entire economy of many small nations. Servaron 10 was managing a floating warehouse that held over 500,000 line items of hardware. To put this in perspective, the Imperial Japanese Navy struggled to provide standardized screws and bolts for their aircraft. Meanwhile, an American mechanic at an advanced base like Ulithi or Manus could pull a specific carburetor for a specific model of radial engine from a climate-controlled concrete barge in the middle of a typhoon zone. The numbers regarding food and comfort were equally devastating to enemy morale. In a single month, the logistics fleet delivered over 40 million pounds of fresh and frozen meat to the Pacific frontline. They delivered enough coffee to brew 100 million cups and enough cigarettes to circle the globe. When Japanese intelligence officers intercepted these manifests, they were stunned. They initially believed the numbers were a form of psychological warfare, deception meant to trick them into thinking American resources were infinite. But as the war progressed, they realized the numbers were real. This abundance had a direct correlation to the survival rate. Because the Americans had floating hospitals that were as well equipped as the finest facilities in New York, a wounded GI had a 97% chance of survival if he reached a corpsman. In contrast, the Japanese, reactive, medical system was collapsing. For them, a wound was often a death sentence. The aftermath of this logistical dominance was a total shift in the human cost of war. The U.S. was able to preserve its most valuable asset, trained, experienced men, while the Japanese were forced to replace veterans with terrified teenagers. The success of the floating factory didn't just win the war in the Pacific, it fundamentally altered the DNA of global military strategy. The consequence was the end of the traditional naval base. The world watched as the U.S. Navy proved it could operate indefinitely without a home. This realization forced every other naval power to rethink their existence. For the Japanese, the aftermath was a psychological shattering. Their entire military culture was based on the spirit, sation, overcoming material lack. They believed that the heroic Japanese soldier, fueled by discipline and sacrifice, would eventually tire out the decadent American. But the American GIs weren't tired, they were well-fed, well-equipped, and backed by an inventive industrial machine that treated miracles as standard operating procedure. The revenge of the assembly line was complete. By the time of the surrender on the USS Missouri, the bay was crowded with the gray silhouettes of the most powerful fleet in human history. But the most significant ships in that harbor weren't just the ones with the big guns. They were the tankers and the supply ships that had traveled thousands of miles to ensure those guns never ran out of shells. The shift in strategy was clear. In modern warfare, the person with the most efficient truck, or in this case, the most efficient barge, wins. The U.S. had demonstrated that superiority wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about owning the environment in which the battle took place. The story of the floating factory is more than a chronicle of ships, tonnage, and supply chains. It is a testament to a fundamental shift in the nature of human conflict. For centuries, war was defined by the limit of a soldier's endurance and the length of a supply wagon's reach. But in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, the United States rewrote that ancient script. By merging the relentless efficiency of the American assembly line with the unpredictable chaos of the front line, they created something the world had never seen, a military force that carried its civilization with it. When we look back at the shocked and stunned accounts of the Japanese high command, we see a realization that transcends military defeat. They weren't just overwhelmed by firepower, they were overwhelmed by a culture that refused to accept the impossible constraints of geography. The American floating factory proved that resourcefulness and invention are the ultimate forms of heroism. While the enemy relied on the static defenses of the past, American logistics experts were inventing the future, turning remote coral reefs into hubs of global power through sheer industrial will. Today, the legacy of Service Squadron 10 lives on in every modern carrier strike group and every global supply chain that keeps our world connected. It reminds us that the true U.S. answer to any challenge isn't just a bigger weapon, but a better way to support the person holding it. The floating factory remains the ultimate symbol of American dominance, a reminder that when industry, kindness, and military power converge, the result is a force that is truly unstoppable. In the end, the war was won not just by those who pulled the triggers, but by those who ensured that, even 6,000 miles from home, an American sailor could still have a taste of Sunday dinner and the promise of a way back.